Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast. This is the last podcast of 2022. It's been quite a year, not a great year. Kind of sort of in the way that people have said every year since 2016. But somehow I don't know. I don't have it right in the front of my mind right now, but I was going through a few days ago that a lot of kind of rough stuff happened in 2022, and yet for some of us it seemed to kind of end on a relative high note. Some of that, for Democrats, they got sort of a pleasant surprise out of the election. We just had the conclusion of the January 6th committee's work. They had that one late night where it's kind of, are we gonna release the report tonight? It was kind of, this was a multi-hundred pages document. So if you're doing substantive changes to the last minute, you don't necessarily want to kind of hit add a bit of text and hit send or whatever. But in any case, they sent that out, so that happened. So we have that, and we're ending the year with kind of a certain level of comic relief in the person of this guy George Santos, who was elected to this district kind of on the outer edge of New York City, part of Queens, and going into Long Island, sort of a fairly affluent district, kind of a Democratic leaning swing district out there, and his whole, as I'm sure you've seen at this point, his whole biography is sort of collapsed, and that is a kind of an ongoing thing. And then you have Kari Lake. The relevant judges have. I mean, she lost almost 2 months ago. This is a very Trump era kind of thing. I mean, she lost, and it wasn't even that close, really. Um, Closer than that other guy whose name whose name escapes me at the moment. No, not him. The senator, the guy Mark Kelly beat. Yeah, Blake Masters. But in any case, what I guess is the sort of the final legal challenge is done. So we're going to talk about all that kind of stuff. I want to remind you that, remember, the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. You can get 25% off your order if you use the promo code TPM, and that's at Grady'sColdBrew.com. So give that a try. So, co-host Kate Riga, what's going on? Last podcast of the year.
Yeah, just some quick housekeeping so we don't forget at the end. But listeners will see this pod drop like a day earlier. So we usually record on Wednesdays. Today it's Tuesday, because everyone is being very nice about accommodating my holiday travel, and I am trying to avoid podcasting from Amtrak. And then next week will also be a bit weird. We're planning to record Friday, so it'll be a couple days past when we usually put them out. But then after that, back to regularly scheduled programming. So that out of the way. Yeah, it's funny. That's a good way to put it, that we have these kind of comedic relief stories, and then we have this pretty deadly serious story. So let's start with the January 6th report, and then we'll kind of get into the more fun stuff. But we had talked last pod about the timing of the report not being ideal for reasons kind of within or without the committee's control. But it was kind of, college kid writing their final essay vibes in these last few days, because we were all at work, many of us kind of working from parents or in-laws houses, and then the day slipped by, hours passed, and we're like, so where's the report? And at first we anticipated the report coming out the same day that Zelensky's surprise visit to the White House was going to happen. So some of us at TPM were kind of speculating maybe they'll push it because they're not going to want to step on, this kind of diplomatic victory for Biden type thing. So they ended up the committee released some transcripts the day of the Zelensky visit and then said, okay, we're going to punt the report until tomorrow. And basically, all of those transcripts were people just pleading the fifth a million times. So it seems like they were just kind of trying to offload the boring stuff. Um, but then another day passes and the report doesn't come out. And then when it finally does come out, it drops at like 10, 11 p.m. a a day or two before Christmas Eve, like really pushing in on the holiday. And as you say, Josh, it was like, 860 pages or something. So we just kind of have this brick, which, I'm sure everyone remembers when the Mueller report dropped and everyone was trying to read it really fast during the workday. And on cable news, you had like anchors talking while people are flipping through the pages. But I think this was more of a case of like, we had our Josh Kavinsky and John Light doing that small hour laboring of sifting through the whole thing. But it does at least seem to me, and I'm curious what you think, Josh, it feels like it didn't have huge ripples because of the timing, or maybe because we just kind of know its core assertions before the report. But I'm almost left with the impression that like those public hearings in the summer, that was the crescendo for the committee. And this almost feels more like both tying up the loose ends and just kind of like dropping this packet off on the DOJ's doorstep and being like, here's what we had, go nuts.
Yeah, I mean, uh, as we know, they are under kind of unique circumstances here, since the other party, which is the one that did the insurrection, is about to take over the House. So they
Right.
need to get it out the door before those guys take over. And they had the additional fact that they were doing some very consequential final legislation. So all of these things were happening at the same time, and that's why it was delayed. I have not seen. I'm curious if you've seen anything specific about whether there were any kind of like last minute substantive decisions that were made or something like that. Presumably it was just kind of like some final formatting and stuff like that. That was the reason. I mean, I've seen different people sort of commenting on, oh, this is the way to step on your story and no one's going to read it and blah 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 blah. I don't basically I don't think any of that matters, and that's for this reason. When the Mueller report came out, we you know basically didn't know anything until it came out. We had inferred things through the various uh, you know the course of the trials and the pleadings and stuff like that, but we didn't really know anything. And as we remember, Bill Barr sort of jumped in to characterize it first, um, with what was at best a highly disingenuous characterization of the report. And then the report itself, in real ways, pulled its punches, and to the extent that it didn't pull its punches, it never really quite recovered from Bill Barr's initial gloss, which was basically saying, "Didn't find anything, all good, move along, nothing, nothing to see here." In this case, there's in all of these report type situations, you've got the sort of the headline gloss, and then you've got all the details. And in this case, we know the headline gloss. Trump's guilty. A bunch of people around Trump are guilty. Here's all the terrible stuff that happened. And that was, as you said, that was heavily previewed, explained, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in the in the hearings. So in a way, yes, they kind of jammed it up into Christmas Eve, but I think basically, who cares? We know the verdict here, and I have no doubt that people are going to now, dig into. I mean, it's 800 pages long. Dig into, and and other news organizations have done that to a limited extent so far. We did some, kind of live blogging when it came out. People will dig into that and get more details, but for public purposes, it's really the headline that is the big thing, and the headline is crystal clear. So I don't buy this idea that I've seen from a lot of commentators that, wow, all this work and you kind of stepped on it and released it, metaphorically, if not literally, last thing on a Friday night. So I basically think it kind of doesn't matter. They just had a lot of stuff they had to get done, and there it is.
I also think in terms of the labor, perhaps what's going to end up being most valuable is, you know, wrenching free documents that people didn't want to give up and like getting those witness interviews and everything. Cause we already know that, kind of the parallel investigation that's going on at DOJ in many cases was following in the footsteps of the January 6th committee, interviewing people who had already been interviewed by the committee and things like that. So I think it's also a bit distinct from Mueller in terms of, like you say, the Mueller report was also our first public impression. The January 6th committee has already done the public impression. So a lot of the value of this stuff is the heavy investigatory lifting, which we were only ever going to kind of get the headlines of anyway, because the people who are investigating are always going to be more in the weeds than the people reading about it. So, I think that's a factor as well.
Yeah, I think it kind of is what it is. I mean, I do think it's not clear to me the extent to which the um, Department of Justice investigation has really been forced along by the committee. We just don't
Hmm.
know that. It's possible, but we don't know that. And there's at least a some evidence that it has been, that the DOJ investigation has been going on for a long time, and we just didn't know about it because that's how federal investigations go. So that remains, I think that remains just an unknown. I do think, though, that if you look at the work of the January 6th committee, it's been incredibly influential and I think very powerful. It has, you know, it's it is hard often to see beyond the day-to-day pushback from Republicans and various commentators and so on and so forth. Oh, this doesn't matter, or that you didn't do it the right way, and blah 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 blah. But I think we look back, and I think across a pretty broad swath of the American political spectrum, no, not the 20 to 30% hardcore Trumpers who supported the insurrection, but across a pretty big swath, there is a strong sense that something very bad happened here. It was not just a bunch of freaks who got up, who you know, sort of lost their cool and stormed the Capitol building. This was a very complex plot that was to do with these fake electors, with the whole different kind of thing, and what has been, the connection that was very important to make, and that the January 6th committee made, is that storming of the Capitol was specifically because they needed a little more time to have the fake electors thing work. So it all comes together, and I think in some ways we saw it in the results of the 2022 election. Uh, I think they did their job, and I think they have been incredibly influential in shaping people's understanding of what happened on that, not just on that day. In some ways, on that, that day is just the focal point. So I think they've been really successful.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think why the hearings for me are the pinnacle of the committee's work versus the report is just they were so dramatically effective in their use of footage we hadn't seen before, or even footage that we had. Um, but I think they did such a good job resurrecting kind of the horror that normal people felt on that day and making the misdeeds of Trump and his, those in his cahoots kind of seem so much worse because they would, splice in, here's what we know about the fake elector scheme, this kind of like weird, arcane, confusing thing, and then splice that in with Mitt Romney having to turn around mid hallway and run away from the mob, or like the screams of police officers and stuff. So almost what they were investigating was just so built to be a visual medium, that I think was their moment of communicating with the public triumph. And now we're just, and the written stuff is almost just a bit more like a bit more weedy, a bit more academic, a bit more, you got to sift through to kind of find the dramatic moments, because they did such a good job of tying those themes together in a way that was really easily digestible, and then I think did filter down to the quote unquote kind of normal populace in a way that written stuff just wouldn't have, because so much of the, social media and all the rest are just such video platforms that it just
Hmm.
worked really well for that.
Yeah, and a lot of that stuff is just a lot of the stuff in the report is there for the record,
Right.
right? Because people can be pouring over this forever. It's not done in this. Well, it may not be done in the sense of it could happen again, but it's not done in the sense that it seems inevitable to me that there will be federal prosecutions that go to this broader conspiracy, and sort of one of the sort of the takeaways of the final hearings that I found more persuasive than I think I anticipated finding is that they set it up in such a way that I think they made referrals against 4 people.
Hmm.
Okay. And they also made sort of referrals by implication to a lot more people. There were kind of headline people than everybody else involved. And if you, they basically just made a strong argument of, if you're going to indict any of these people, how can you not indict Trump?
Right.
Because he's the one who did the whole thing. He's the one who came up with the idea. None of it would have happened without him. He took the basic acts. So I come out of it really kind of thinking that he will be charged with crimes here, just because basically because I think they made an overwhelming case that there were that there were grave criminal acts that happened here, and they made a very I, I mean, how do you even call it a case? I mean, he did it. I mean, he's the center of it. So I think for me, I always kind of assume, and I think this is in many, often a correct assumption. Charging the president's a pretty big deal. It is a big deal, and it is something that comes with a lot of very fateful consequences. It's not just, well, president's not above the law. It's always going to be more complicated than that. But once you establish that there was a seditious attempt to overturn the results of an election and really overturn the constitutional order, and that a lot of people committed crimes and the president was the ringleader, just how do you not go there? Are you really going to indict John Eastman and that Chesbro guy and a few others, and somehow like you don't indict Trump? That it would be kind of absurd.
Yeah, and I think Jamie Raskin kind of, he made that point during that final hearing where he was like, this is not about going after the foot soldiers and exonerating the people who were, commanding them into battle, basically. And I mean, I think you're right. The overriding theme of the report is it's all about Trump. And we know from reports that they've shaved off bits of it that were more tangential to the Trump piece, which, has angered some people related to the committee. But that was the driving purpose, is to show that this man was culpable and, to try their best to get him eliminated from contention and running again. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you, because what do you, what, you gonna take out the right hand men and then be like, I mean, what would be the possible argument for exonerating Trump? I mean, the report is full of so much, direct evidence of his extensive involvement. I mean, calling up legislators. This was not a guy who was kind of working the puppet strings from above. He was, getting his hands
Very
dirty.
hands-on, very
Yeah.
hands-on. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that another thing, I think this may have been Jamie Raskin who focused on this. There has been, and I think a lot of us have sort of in spite of ourselves been kind of lulled into, if not believing this, at least kind of crediting it at some level, that with the top Trumpers, there's been this argument of, hey, that violent stuff that happened on Capitol Hill, that's out of control. That's a crime. Hold those people to account. But we weren't doing anything violent. We're just filling out forms and making phone calls
Mhm.
and making petitions before courts. Like, how can we be doing? We didn't do anything violent, so how can you be saying we did anything wrong? And you know, that's not really a standard that applies in any kind of law or in any kind of coup. There are lots of bloodless coups, right? And it even goes a little bit beyond that. They have this way of kind of saying, they create this kind of alternative legal universe where we just thought we could submit fake electors, and like, if we were wrong, like, okay, my bad, but like, that was just a kind of a good faith misunderstanding. Like,
Right.
it's not a crime. And so I think on both of those counts, the foot soldiers versus ringleaders, violence versus not violent, you know I think they did a pretty good, pretty good shot of that. And I just, one other point, and I think this is, often things that are not completely logical have a lot of bearing. I think the stuff that Trump got himself into with these classified documents at Mar-a-Lago have hurt him a lot in terms of criminal culpability on the January 6th stuff, even though they're not really connected in any way. I mean, you can say they're connected in the broader sense of his criminality or thinking he's above the law, but they're not, meaningfully connected. But what he did there is just clearly against the law. And I think he will be charged with that. I mean, I'm not sure, but like, it's hard for me to see how he how he won't be. And once you're kind of charging the president, in for a dime, in for a dollar, right? And I don't mean that I don't mean that in a trivializing sense, but once you make the judgment that, notwithstanding the fact that this man was president, and notwithstanding the fact that the president has a lot of, prerogatives and judgment calls that constitutionally he can make, which at least complicates a lot of it, a lot of the function of the law. Once you decide, man, he just blew right through that. He broke the law, and like, he's got to be charged. Then you look at it like, we've already got a lawbreaker here. We've kind of crossed that line. So I do think that has hurt him.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be necessary, but it has.
And in terms of the foot soldier piece, which I think we can kind of transition into another topic we want to talk about, this like cottage industry that's sprung up after 2020 of the lawyers, the quote unquote expert witnesses who all kind of operate in these vaguely MAGA circles, and they stake their name on trying to overturn first Trump's election. That's where most of them kind of rose to the surface, back when we were all like, who is this guy? And now it's just like the same people keep kind of cropping up in all of these cases. um it does kind of, I think, add to the onus to not just nab Trump, but also to show that there are any repercussions for kind of using the court to this anti-democratic purpose. And it's funny because there's been such a straight line to the Kari Lake ongoing circus from that effort. I mean, her lawyers are Kurt Olson, who was, kind of spearheaded a lot of the 2020 stuff for Trump, who came from like nowhere, and then in those graspy desperate days of how do we overturn the election, he like crops up as this, ideas guy, and he talked to Trump multiple times on January 6th. And then you've got Brian Blem, who is definitely the funnier figure of the two, but he kind of made his first name representing the tech firm, the cyber ninjas, after the Arizona, quote fraud it type thing. But it is funny how it has become this whole cottage industry. It's these like lawyers who often come from weird backgrounds, like they used to be like divorce attorneys or whatever, and now they're just big lie guys. But they
Right.
come with this cavalcade of, these quote unquote experts who get on the stand and are like, I have 20 years of studying ballot chain custody and the procedures and all this kind of stuff. And it's funny because I think the court doesn't quite know what to do with like self-professed experts, but they get up there and then you like do kind of Google searches while they're talking, and oh, they went on Cleta Mitchell's podcast, or he was a speaker at Mike Lindell's symposium. And it's these people who have just like a bare sprinkling of legitimacy somewhere in their resume that can then be like, and I'm an expert in election security. And it's like, okay, well, I'm an expert at the Harry Potter books, but like that doesn't make for a side hustle or a profession for me,
Right.
But you got those lawyers coming to Lake's thing, and then they put these people up on the stand who they had this one woman who her big claim to fame is she knows all about ballot handling, and she goes around and testifies on podcasts about like the grievous errors in how Americans handle our ballots and how it leaves us open to all kinds of fraud. And she like did all this stuff on the stand about that. And then the county's lawyers get up there and they're like, have you ever worked as an election official? No. Have you ever been a legitimate part of an election? No. Have you even volunteered to be a poll watcher? No. But this whole crop of people really gravitated to this big lie thing. And the fact that now post 2020 we've just got this crop of candidates who make their name on this, who run their campaign on 2020 being stolen, and who then, like Kari Lake, as she telegraphed ahead of time, if she lost her election, she was going to say it was because of fraud.
Right.
And now since our last recording, we talked about the 2 days of trial that were happening. During the days of trial, you just had, I did mock trial in high school, and I think I am like better versed in some of just the rudimentary procedural rules than Kari Lake's guys were. There was like just multiple instances of absolute hullabaloo where they just didn't follow the basic rules of the court. And like at one point, you have them trying to call a witness who they didn't put on the witness list ahead of time. So the defense was like, what? Who is this person? You can't like spring things on people at trial. And so that just sets off this feverish like whispering session of the Lakes lawyers to try to figure out who the heck to call instead. And the judge just being like, what is going on? And then you have another time where they try to play this voicemail into evidence that they never like
Authentic
uploaded. So
authenticated or
oh,
yeah, yeah,
definitely
yeah,
not. Yeah,
yeah.
but they never even uploaded. So, the defense had never heard it before. And it was just, or you would have the defense object to something, and then the judge, they either sustain the objection or they overrule it. And then you would have Lake's lawyers trying to argue with the judge about how he ruled on the objection. And the judge had to be like, I'm not accustomed in my courtroom to having people fight with me about, so it's just like the endless,
Well, are
endless
these
stuff
people?
like
I mean,
that.
these people are at least lawyers, right? I mean, they may,
Hmm.
or at least they've been in divorce court or something. So it's not like right. I mean, it's
Yeah, no, you are
well,
correct.
wasn't there something I thought I heard that there was actually. I mean, she tried to kind of play it off as sort of a joke in a way, but there was Kari Lake made a statement where basically she was having a really hard time finding any lawyers
Mhm.
because all of the lawyers were like, I don't want to get disbarred, like,
Right.
or I don't want to get fired from my firm. They were, they were treating this about, the deep state and
Mhm.
blah, 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 blah. But that does kind of go to show that the post big lie proper, uh, uh, bar discipline activities have had an effect, that
Right.
people have seen, that people who would be ideologically down for this have seen that and say, I don't want to get disbarred. I don't want to lose my right to practice law. So sorry. And at least from what Lake was saying, that was having an effect.
Yeah, which is where we are now. So on Christmas Eve, the judge dismissed the last two claims of her lawsuit, which were basically premised on the idea that these ballot printing machines malfunctioned and people didn't get their votes tabulated because of that. And then these other claims that the ballot chain of custody was broken and that somehow tons of illegal votes were like plugged in. Um, and they were, I mean, everything they presented was just so speculative, or it'll be some kind of like technological malfunction, right? Like maybe something with these printers did happen, but then you would have the actual election people testify that, okay, when that happens, there's a remedy, right? You have that vote replicated on a ballot that is formatted correctly and can be counted. But so you had Lake's people up there being like, the printers were broken and there were long lines, ergo
I
there were
win.
40,000 votes for Lake that were not counted,
Well,
right?
wasn't there, I think the judge had a statement where he said, he summarized the Lake attorney's argument basically being, you're asking me to invalidate hundreds of thousands of votes that were cast, and you were asking me to include tens of thousands of votes that were never cast and
Right.
presumably count them for you,
Well,
because
yeah.
why?
I mean, Lake wasn't even just asking for a new election. Her primary ask was to be declared the winner of the election. I mean, ridiculous. But so he dismissed the last two claims and
And
was
this was a state court judge, right?
yeah, this is
Yeah, okay.
Maricopa County Superior Court. And he is a very mild mannered guy, this judge. He was like initially appointed by a fairly Trumpy governor. Um, but I thought the dismissal was like very kind of well reasoned. He went through her witnesses one by one to kind of explain why this is not evidence, why people's speculation is not enough to like overthrow an election. And then he also gave a few days if the county and Katie Hobbs's team want to file sanctions against Lake's team, which ties into what you were saying. And the county and Hobbs have both individually filed for sanctions. They want them against Lake's lawyers, but also Lake herself. And I do think that's something, like you say, that has come post January 6th, in part just because people who are on the other side of these big lie cases, I think, are just kind of becoming better accustomed to what you do in this situation. Because this idea of kind of flooding the courts with these frivolous big lie lawsuits was, fairly novel in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Like you would have in some states, they would say, we haven't had lawsuits over elections barring cases where there's like a 5 vote differential,
Right, right,
in
right.
decades or whatever. So you've got, the Maricopa County people are just kind of asking more modestly to cover the attorney fees for the 2 days of trial, and Katie Hobbs people are being like, nope, we want $500,000 to cover all this stuff. And then meanwhile, of course, Kari Lake not going to exit the money train, which is this, fight for my election type thing. Also, retweeted a conspiracy theory that Mark Elias, who's kind of the big wig Democrats election lawyer, he and other lefty lawyers ghost wrote the judge's opinion, that they emailed this judge and told him what to say. And
I mean, that's not a
the
way to
county,
ingratiate yourself with the judge,
right,
to put it
exactly.
mildly.
And so the county included that in their motion for sanction, and Kari Lake has since deleted the tweet. So it's just such a mess. And of course, she's also already vowed that she'll, appeal the decision, because once again, and this is obvious, but these cases are so clearly not about or not just about overturning the election, right? Like that's almost a happy bonus if that were to happen. But this means she gets to fundraise off this stuff. She gets to like go on right-wing media and yell about it and have other people in the right-wing media say, all I want for Christmas is a Kari Lake victory. It's such a good way to keep her
Yeah, she's like a
central.
martyr,
Yeah, even while she's
basically.
not running for anything. It's just
Although I would say this though, it is in many ways the sort of the story of the 2022 election is that she's really the odd woman out,
mhm,
because you just saw all these other people say, "Well, guess I lost.
right.
I'm sure sad I lost. Maybe I can run again someday and not lose." You know, I mean, basically, no one did this. Or very, very few people did this, and even people who lost by narrower margins, right?
Yep.
And so she's kind of, uh, kind of out there on her own, and just out there on her own. She's kind of the only high profile one who decided to play this card, and that is telling, and telling in a in a good way in itself. I mean, in some ways, I don't know how much this played into it, but certainly I think, I mean, I know I think it's pretty clear she was expecting to win. And a
Mhm,
lot of people were expecting her to win. I was expecting her to win.
mhm.
Just that's kind of what the polls showed. She had been. I'm not saying I was sure she was going to win, but I think the polls had shown, her up a point, 2 or 3 points over Katie Hobbs. And there was also this general sense that Katie Hobbs had not run a great campaign, largely because she refused to debate Kari Lake. I mean, you know, I don't know. I don't know if it's that she really did run a great campaign and people didn't, kind of understand her strategy or see how well she was doing, or if she just ran a lackluster campaign, but people saw that Kari Lake was bonkers and she lost. I mean, I have no idea. At some level, you've got to kind of say, you know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. She won, so you can't have been that bad a campaign.
Right.
Um, but it is good in as much as, she is she's the example that's sort of, the exception that proves the rule for 2022. Got Mehmet Oz, you got Herschel Walker, even I mean, probably a little harder to do for Blake Masters, since what he lost by like 10 points or something like that. Um, but she's kind of the only one, and uh, that has made her challenge sort of even a little more ridiculous than it might have been, a little less menacing than it might have been. And I think you can see at some level, and this is something we're going to have to talk about a lot more in future pods, that there are elements in the Republican Party that want to move on from this. I'm not saying they're above stealing an election, but they're not crazy about these kind of like absurd situations where you've got like, Rudy with the Kraken and stuff like that. In any case, so yeah. So
Yeah.
that's that.
I mean, also though, shows how hard she's working to stay in Trump's good graces, and how just vociferously she is thirsting for the vice presidential nod. I mean, all of this is clearly driving in that direction because she's making herself s- the only way to kind of not be a loser in Trump's eyes is to dedicate yourself mind, body, and soul to saying his election was stolen and now mine was too because of the same thing that robbed him. She's still kind of maintaining her utter fealty to him,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
weirdly, even while she's kind of becoming so poisonous to much of the party and losing in the most like loud attention grabby way possible, she's also clearly keeping herself in contention for being on the ticket of the presumed 2024 frontrunner.
Yeah, and also, well, I guess what is it? I'm used to Georgia and Arizona having like two senatorial elections like every single cycle.
Right.
I guess we're past that now. It's very hard right now to see how you get there, but we don't know what happens in 2 years. It's certainly possible that things go in a weird direction, and maybe she runs for Kirsten Sinema's seat. I mean, who knows, right? There's
Yeah.
lots of potential options, but there you go.
So let's round off the show with the newest dispatches from the talented Mr. Santos. I think last we spoke of him, we knew we had all this resume stuff that was, the New York Times piece had come out proving that basically everything was made up and that he makes, even outlandish claims outside of the fact that he didn't seem to graduate from where he said he graduated from or work where he said he worked from, but also, that he's had employees that were murdered. That didn't seem to be true. And then we also had kind of some inklings of the weird stuff going on in Brazil, his home country. And since we last
Or I
talked,
guess we should say that itself is a question.
right,
It's
okay.
it's the country of his background.
Right.
He says he was born in Queens, and he may well have been born in Queens. It's one of these things where, in the normal course of events, if someone says, "I was born in Queens," you say, "Okay, cool." Right? You don't like, the sort of what Republicans do, demanding
Right.
birth certificates and stuff. But when everything else is a lie, you start you kind of need to ask. And at least some of his former coworkers say that he used to tell them he was born in Brazil. So
Right.
like it's at least worth, it's not like it's not like it requires any big investigation. There's a birth certificate over in some hospital in Queens somewhere. Just look it up, and it's easy enough to prove. But anyway, go ahead.
Right. So since that time, there's been kind of an explosion of developments in this story. He had tweeted, truth will out and I will tell the truth, some like weird amount of time from this like next week or something, which is like, yeah, that sounds like you are going to just neatly rebut this if it takes you a week to get your house in order. And he had given an exclusive interview to the New York Post. That's right. And
Yeah.
then we kind of had orbiting pieces come out looking at these different angles and everything. So give us a reader's digest of where we are now versus where we are, last pod.
All right. So you start off, as Kate said, that really everything in his bio, work history, educational history, just sort of random event history, everything false. And that's what kind of got the ball rolling. In addition to that, you have things that, I mean, there's there's no law against going on the campaign trail and saying, "Yeah, I used to own Goldman Sachs." I mean, that's up to the voters, right? If they want to be taken in by that. But then there were also questions about his like financial disclosures, campaign disclosures. Those are things that, like, if you lie on those, that's a big felony. That's a big deal. So there's been the totally made up biography. And then there are a number of things that potentially could be serious criminal offenses that could get him in a lot of legal trouble. And then on the, beyond things about where he worked and stuff like that. Like one thing, sometimes he said he was Catholic, and other times he said he was Jewish. And not to be too cheeky, but for that district, kind of makes sense. In Queens, you will be Catholic, and up on the North Shore, maybe you'd be Jewish, right? Cover all your bases. And the Jewish thing was added to by the fact that he had this kind of story about his family being, escaped the Holocaust and stuff. Which, one thing to say you're Jewish when you're not, but don't bring the Holocaust. Don't bring in sort of stolen valor about the Holocaust in it. In any case, one of the things when he supposedly came clean finally was, he said, I mean, he actually said this. He said, "I didn't mean I was Jewish. I meant I was Jew-ish." Which, I mean, like, dude, come on, like, what?
I
Like,
saw that singular quote
Yeah.
absolutely everywhere.
Yeah. Well, and also he said that, one of his things was that he was an executive at Goldman Sachs and at Citibank, senior vice president, all this kind of stuff. Well, he wasn't. And when he tried to explain this, he said, well, it was a poor choice of words. I never worked directly for Citi or Goldman, but my company did business with Citi and Goldman. And you're sort of like, yeah, that's a very poor choice of words. Since the words you use were lying about, this isn't like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon by like investment banks. Like you worked there or you didn't, dude. So in any case, you got all the lies. He said maybe Christmas Eve, like, questions have been raised. I have a story to tell, and next week I'm gonna tell my story. So hold tight, Merry Christmas, peeps, and all that. So he did this interview with the New York Post, obviously about as friendly a venue as he could find. And the Post first put out a very short piece, which wasn't protecting him exactly, but was kind of being as generous as you could, given the sort of the unclimbable mountain of ridiculous lies. Like, what are you going to say? What is your story possibly going to be? Like, are you going into lie rehab or something, or like, or what? But in any case, so he said the thing about like poor choice of words for his education. The one thing he kind of just like directly copped to is like, yeah, I didn't graduate from Baruch College. In fact, I didn't graduate anywhere. Sorry.
I swear to God, though, my impression when I read that is that the only reason he copped to it is because you could almost sense he thought there might be some political upside in being like, "Yeah, I'm not a college elite,
Yeah,
I'm just a dude."
basic. I mean, yeah, and along with being Jewish and being this and being that. So here I did a post this morning, and I think this is where this is going, because his overall response to the completely fake resume is basically lol, whatever, sorry, move on, next, kind of like who, sort of like who cares. But here's where the kind of the rubber meets the road. I mentioned before, there are real questions about whether he falsified his financial disclosure documents. If that's true, that's a big deal. You go to jail for that. Okay, so that's where it becomes more real. The other thing is, so he is gay, and he says he's married to a man now. Even that is sort of whether they're married or not. I mean, kind of doesn't matter that much whether they're legally married. But this was a big part of his campaign bio, because basically his whole thing was, I am openly gay. I'm so gay. I'm gay 24/7, and this has never been a problem for me in 10 years in the Republican Party. So all this stuff about Republicans being non-inclusive, that's all Democratic propaganda, blah 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 blah. So what comes out pretty soon is, in fact, until a couple months before he ran the first time in 2020, he was married to a woman. Now, I think, as we know, there are certain people who are bisexual. There are certain people who were in the closet, and then they, sort of came out of the closet. So a lot of potential scenarios there. But without going into all the details, there's at least a decent amount of circumstantial evidence that was a sham marriage for the purpose of getting that woman a green card and allowing her to become a citizen. So if that's the case, that is another big time crime. Marriage fraud for the purposes of citizenship, you go to jail for. I mean, it's a big deal crime. So again, another potential crime, and I'm not just and kind of like you can say anybody could have done anything, but these are things where there's not proof, but there's a significant amount of circumstantial evidence. There's no evidence he ever cohabited with this woman. It seems like he was dating men through the time they were married. Again, people have got all sorts of lifestyles. Who knows? But kind of points in that direction. That, and if that's true, that's a big deal. Then there's the fact that when he was 19, he was living in Brazil with his mom. His mom was working as a home health aide, and this is like another weird thing. Part of his bio was that his mom was the first executive at a major investment bank. His mom was a home health aide and a cleaning woman,
God, he has
which
quite an investment bank hang up in particular.
yeah, and again, that's totally honorable work. But again, the guy's kind of a pathological liar, right? So in any case, there in Rio de Janeiro, she's working as a home health aide. He steals checks from one of the elderly men under her care and goes and buys a bunch of clothes and shoes and whatever. He gets caught, and the story of how he gets caught is a little bizarre and weird and funny in itself. Basically, he takes the checks, he goes to the store, buys a bunch of stuff. The clerk pretty quickly after he buys the stuff is like, something's weird here. So he calls the phone numbers on the checks. They don't go anywhere. She's like, I got bamboozled. And then the clerk has to pay back the store, which that's a little rough. I don't know how, I guess that's how things roll in Brazil or in that store or whatever. But so he's kind of pissed. Then George gives a pair of shoes he bought in this little caper to his boyfriend. Okay, little more evidence, at least verifying that he's not making up being gay, because this is 14 years ago, something like that. He's 19 years old. So, but he doesn't tell the boyfriend that he stole them. So a couple days later, the boyfriend goes back to the store, like, hey, I want to exchange the shoes, and he gets the same clerk, and the clerk's like, wait a second, these are the shoes that other dude passed the bad checks for. So he processes, I don't know, exchanges them or whatever. And then he follows the boyfriend. Turns out the boyfriend works at a store nearby. In any case, this allows him to find the boyfriend on social media. And then he finds, I think that George said he was Delio, who's the old man, the 80-something-year-old man. Finds Delio on the social network, but he's George Santos. So anyway, so that's how he gets caught. He gets charged, and then he bails. So basically, George is a fugitive from justice in Brazil. Relatively small crime. I think this was maybe hundreds of dollars or maybe a few thousands of dollars. But still, all this kind of stuff. And then the last thing is,
Can I
which
just
we've,
quickly
yeah,
interject that this clerk is absolutely in the wrong line of work? He needs
totally.
to open himself up a little PI shop or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, no, totally. And he actually did an interview in one of the big Brazilian papers that
Nice.
I used when I wrote up that story. In any case, the final thing is George Santos a citizen of the United States? And again, normally you kind of take people's word for that. But again, there are former coworkers who say he was born in Brazil, not in Queens. Obviously, he could have been born in Brazil and be naturalized, totally possible, but it's one or the other, right? And kind of like you want to kind of nail that down. Ironically, the best evidence that Santos is a citizen is that it seems like he was involved in immigration fraud with the sham marriage, right? So this felony, this potential felony, may be his best, his sort of ace in the hole for eligibility to serve in Congress. Because obviously, if he married this woman to get her a green card, he would have to be a citizen, or else why would you do it, right? So in any case, that is kind of where we are. That this guy has a totally made up bio. He's sort of kind of come clean now by saying, lol, nothing matters. And I kind of worked at Citi in the sense of like, I went to a Citibank branch one time, that a bunch of nonsense. But then we have a number of things that potentially could be crimes, in which case it accelerates pretty quickly. And then the final thing is, what is interesting about this is that, remember, Republicans have a 5-seat majority in the House. So they really need, Kevin McCarthy really needs that vote. So Kevin McCarthy at least really needs George Santos to get sworn in. I guess it's on the 1st of, they swear them in on the 1st of January, and I think the leadership or the speaker election is on the 3rd.
Mm-hmm.
So he needs Santos, because it's basically a Democratic district. So if he resigns, there's a special election. Odds are he probably gets replaced by a Democrat. So that is admittedly lengthy. The full the story of George Santos, or the true meaning of George Santos as of this morning.
Yeah, and the upshot being that, like, there's virtually no chance he's going anywhere because of his political value just means, I mean, can you imagine even what more we're going to find out about this guy? When you lie about every single thing in your life, that's a lot of stuff to untap, you know? I think we're going to be talking about him
giving
for a while.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, there's even this gives you a sense of how many bad things there are. That one of the things is during his, I didn't even mention that between 2000, when he was kind of, I don't know, he made $50,000 in a year, he had no assets. Now he has like $11 million in assets and makes about $1 million a year. So, like, okay, guess you had a pretty good 2 years, right? Things really kind of came together for you. He says it's all about this company he has, but that company doesn't really seem to exist. So that's a whole other, that is a whole other thing. Wait, well, I even lost. Oh, also during this period, the golden 2 years, he worked for a company that the SEC seized all its assets because it's a Ponzi scheme. That's impressive. Nice. Now, in the legal filings, he has not come up with one of the bad guys, and he's kind of said, "Hey, you never know who you're working for. Caught me off guard." Which, okay, maybe they didn't charge him with anything, but that kind of shows you that those are his good. Those are the good parts of his resume. That he unknowingly was part of a Ponzi scheme that the SEC like seized all of its assets.
And on that note, I guess that's a wrap for 2022.
Yeah. Well, I will say that, and number of people on a more serious note, number of people have asked, does this mean he's not eligible? He was too late for the Golden Dukes for 2022. In fact, the eligibility for 2022 had already closed. So Santos will be eligible for the Dukes in 2023. I know a lot of people had a question about that, but that is how that is resolved. So, and it seems little question that this story will mainly be a 2023 story, because it's not going anywhere. It's just a question of how long he remains in Congress or remains at large. Basically, I don't know, maybe flee to Brazil, right? Because I think I found out that they don't have an extradition treaty, so that may come in handy for George Santos.
Man,
there you go.
All right.
Okay. Well, remember that the Josh Marshall podcast brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. You can get 25% off using the promo code TPM at Grady'sColdBrew.com. And yeah, I guess that's 2022. The Josh Marshall
we'll
podcast.
See you guys next year. Remember, our episode next week will come a couple of days later than expected, but it will be there to fortify you going into the new year.
Yeah, fret not. It will be there.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.